The story you're about to hear will touch your heart in ways you never imagined. What happened that dust-filled afternoon changed a veteran's life forever. Like, share, and don't forget to comment where you're watching from. Heat waves shimmered across the vast, empty landscape of Silverridge Valley as dust swirled in miniature tornadoes across the parched earth. The small town on the edge of Nevada's high desert rarely saw visitors outside of those passing through on their way to somewhere more promising. Here the mountains stood like ancient sentinels against an impossibly blue sky, and time seemed to move as slowly as the shadows creeping across the cracked earth. At the very outskirts of town, where civilization gradually surrendered to wilderness, stood a weathered ranch house with a wraparound porch. The paint had long since been scoured away by sandstorms and summer heat, leaving the wood silver gray and splintered in places. A battered American flag hung limply from a post, occasionally stirring when a rare breeze managed to find its way through the valley. Inside the ranch house, 7-year-old Lily Martinez sat cross-legged on the living room floor near the front window, her dark braids falling over her shoulders as she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the glass. The afternoon heat didn't bother her. Instead, it fascinated her. Each wave of heat rippling across the landscape transformed the distant mountains into dancing mirages that captivated her imagination. 1, 2, 3. She counted softly, timing the intervals between the dust devils that spun across their property. Her small fingers traced invisible patterns on the window pane, mimicking their spiral dance. "That means the wind is changing," Lily whispered to herself, repeating the weather wisdom her grandfather had taught her before he passed. Lily's mother, Elena, appeared in the doorway that led to the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Worry lines creased her forehead as she watched her daughter sitting so still by the window. At 36, Elena's once smooth face had begun to show the marks of a hard life, single motherhood, financial struggles, and the constant worry about her brother. "Lily, mi corazon, come away from there," she called. "It's too hot by the window and I need help setting the table. Your uncle will be home soon." Lily turned, her round face illuminated by the harsh sunlight streaming through the glass. "But Mama, I'm watching for the wild horses. Tío Marco said they sometimes come near the property when it's very hot. They look for water." In the kitchen, Marco Vasquez chopped vegetables for a salad, his movements mechanical and precise. The knife hit the cutting board with military regularity, the sound echoing Lily's rhythmic counting at the window. At 34, Marco's face was handsome but weathered beyond his years, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His right sleeve hung empty, pinned neatly at the shoulder, a visual reminder of what the war had taken from him. "Let her be, Elena," Marco said, his voice soft but carrying the unmistakable authority that 4 tours in Afghanistan had instilled in him. "She's fine where she is. Besides, those Mustangs aren't likely to come around with this drought." He set down the knife and reached for his water glass, his left hand moving with the deliberate care of someone who had been forced to relearn the simplest tasks. Elena sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly at her brother's reassurance. I know. I just worry." She glanced back at Lily, who had returned to her vigil at the window. "She's so much like Papa, always watching, always noticing things the rest of us miss." "Not small, but observant," Marco replied with the ghost of a smile. "Just like her mother." The siblings had moved to this remote ranch 6 months ago, following Marco's medical discharge from the army. After losing his arm to an IED explosion, he had spent months in rehabilitation, fighting not just to regain his physical capabilities, but also to outrun the shadows that followed him from the battlefield. Elena, who had been struggling as a single mother in Phoenix after her husband left, didn't hesitate when Marco suggested they pool their resources and start fresh somewhere quiet. The ranch had been affordable precisely because no one wanted it. Too remote, too run down, too much work for most people. But for Marco, the endless space and isolation were exactly what he needed. And for Elena and Lily, it offered stability after years of uncertainty. Lily continued her vigil at the window, completely absorbed in her observation of the landscape. The afternoon heat had reached its peak, and the air inside the house was stifling despite the ancient ceiling fan that turned lazily overhead. The property stretched out before her, 30 acres of scrubland dotted with sagebrush and the occasional twisted juniper. Beyond their fence line, the land rose gradually toward the foothills where, according to local legend, a herd of wild Mustangs still roamed free, descendants of horses that had escaped from Spanish explorers centuries ago. Marco had told her stories about these horses, how they were the embodiment of the American spirit, untamed and resilient. "They're survivors," he had explained one night as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Just like us, Princessa. They bend but don't break." "Lunch in 15 minutes, Elena called from the kitchen, the aroma of her homemade tortilla soup filling the house, fighting against the oppressive heat. The recipe had been her grandmother's, passed down through generations, and cooking it always made their house feel more like home, no matter how recently they had moved in. "Okay, Mama," Lily answered absently, her attention still fixed on the shimmering horizon. Marco finished setting the table, placing Lily's favorite sun-patterned plate at her usual spot. His movements were slower than before his injury, but over the months he had developed a system for most household tasks. Occupational therapy had taught him practical adaptations, but it was his own stubborn determination that drove him to maintain as much independence as possible. "Hey, pequeña exploradora," he called to his niece. "Time to wash up soon." Lily nodded without turning from the window. She was about to stand when something caught her eye, a movement different from the swirling dust and heat mirages. She froze, narrowing her eyes to focus on the distant fence line where their property met the public land beyond. There it was again, something large moving slowly across the landscape. Not the mechanical movement of a vehicle, but the organic flow of living creatures. Lily pressed her face closer to the glass, her breath fogging the surface briefly before evaporating in the heat. "Tío Marco!" she called, excitement rising in her voice. "Tío Marco, come quick, I think I see them." Marco set down the water pitcher he'd been filling, his brow furrowing. "See what, Lily? The horses. The wild horses are coming this way." Elena appeared in the doorway, concern etched on her face. Living in the desert had taught her caution. Unexpected visitors of any kind could spell trouble. "Marco, check what she's seeing, please." Marco crossed the room to join Lily at the window. He placed his hand on her shoulder and leaned down to follow her pointing finger. Through the heat-warped air, he could make out several shapes moving, slowly toward their property. Not the sharp, angular silhouettes of vehicles, but the unmistakable fluid forms of horses, one larger figure in front and several smaller ones following behind. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, forgetting momentarily to watch his language around Lily. "You've got good eyes, pequeña. Those are horses, all right." Lily bounced excitedly, her braids swinging. "See, Mama, I told you they would come. Can we go outside and see them closer?" Elena joined them at the window, shading her eyes against the glare. "They're probably just passing through, looking for water. The creek on our property might still have some, even with the drought." Marco studied the approaching horses with increasing interest. As they drew nearer, details became clearer through the rippling heat. The lead horse was a mare, palomino with a blonde mane that caught the sunlight like spun gold. Behind her, you followed 3 foals, their coats varying from deep chestnut to a dappled gray. They moved with obvious fatigue, their heads lowered against the relentless sun. "They don't look good, Elena," Marco said quietly, so Lily wouldn't hear. "That mare is too thin, and she's favoring her right front leg. And those foals, they're dehydrated for sure. Elena's expression softened from concern to compassion. Like many who had grown up in the Southwest, she had a deep respect for the Mustangs. These living symbols of freedom had roamed these lands, long before any of their ancestors had arrived. The drought has been hard on everything this year. As the small herd approached their fence line, Marco's trained eye noticed more details. The mare's coat, which should have gleamed like polished gold, was dull and matted in places. One of the foals, the smallest, stumbled occasionally, struggling to keep pace with its siblings. Despite her obvious exhaustion, the mare continuously circled back to nudge the struggling foal forward, never leaving it behind. "Mama, they need help," Lily said with the simple clarity of a child. "They look thirsty and tired." Marco nodded slowly. "The creek on our back property might still have some water, but they'd need to go around the fence to reach it." He frowned, considering. Strange they'd come so close to the house, though. Wild Mustangs usually avoid human dwellings. Elena watched the horses with growing concern. The mare had reached their fence line and stopped, the foals gathering close to her sides. Instead of continuing around the property toward the creek, she stood still, her head raised as if studying the house. "What's she doing?" Elena wondered aloud. Marco shook his head, puzzled. Years of military training had taught him to notice details others might miss. And something about the mare's behavior struck him as unusual. She wasn't acting like a typical wild horse encountering human territory. There was purpose in her stance, an almost deliberate quality to her stillness. The mare took several steps closer to the house, then stopped again, her ears pricked forward attentively. One of the foals, the dappled grey, whinnied softly, a sound that carried clearly across the still afternoon air. "She's looking at us," Lily whispered, wonder filling her voice. "She's looking right at us, Tío Marco." Marco felt a chill despite the heat. The mare was indeed looking toward the house, her gaze unnervingly direct. 15 years in the military had honed his instincts, and every one of them was telling him this wasn't normal wild horse behavior. Elena must have sensed it too. "Marco," she said quietly, "has anyone in town mentioned missing horses? Could they be domesticated ones that escaped during the storm last week?" Marco considered this. Jacobson, over at the general store, would have mentioned it. People around here keep track of each other's livestock. He continued to study the mare, who had taken another cautious step toward the house. "No, these are Mustangs. Look at their build, leaner than ranch horses, and no signs of shoes or handling." The mare suddenly raised her head and let out a long, low whinny that seemed to hang in the hot, still air. The sound wasn't aggressive or frightened. It carried a quality that made Marco's skin prickle with recognition. It was a call for attention. Lily pressed her hands against the glass. "She's asking for something, Tío. I think she wants us to help her." "Lily, honey, wild horses don't ask humans for help," Elena said gently, though uncertainty tinged her voice. But Marco wasn't so sure. As a soldier, he had seen animals in war zones sometimes approach humans when desperate enough, usually for food, occasionally for help with injuries. Extreme circumstances could override natural caution. "I'm going outside," he decided abruptly. "Elena, stay here with Lily." "What?" "Marco, no, those are wild animals. You don't know how they'll react, especially with the foals." Marco was already moving toward the door, his decision made. "I'll keep my distance. But something's not right, and I need to see what's happening." "I want to come too," Lily protested, jumping up from her spot by the window. "No, pequeña," Marco said firmly. "You stay with your mama. I'll be right back." Before Elena could argue, further, Marco had stepped onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. The heat hit him like a physical wall, the air so dry it seemed to pull moisture from his skin with each breath. He stood motionless for a moment, allowing the horses to register his presence. The mare's reaction confirmed his suspicions that this was no ordinary encounter. Rather than startling or retreating at the sight of a human, she took several deliberate steps closer to the house, stopping about 30 yards away. The foals clustered behind her, the smallest one visibly trembling with exhaustion. Marco slowly descended the porch steps, moving with the deliberate calm he had used when approaching nervous civilians in war zones. "Easy there," he murmured, though he knew his voice wouldn't carry meaning to the horse. "What's brought you? Here, girl?" The mare watched him intently, ears forward, body tense but not fearful. Then, to Marco's astonishment, she pawed at the ground 3 times in quick succession before looking back up at him. The gesture seemed almost communicative. Inside the house, Lily and Elena watched through the window. "Look, Mama," Lily whispered excitedly. "She's talking to Tío." The mare took another step forward, then stopped, whinnying again, this time with more urgency. She turned slightly, revealing her right side more clearly, and Marco sucked in a breath. A long gash ran along her flank, not fresh but certainly recent, crusted with dried blood and desert dust. It wasn't life-threatening, but it explained the limping he had noticed earlier. "You're hurt," he said softly, instinctively reaching out before catching himself. Wild horse or not, approaching an injured animal with foals was asking for trouble. The Mare, however, held her ground, neither advancing nor retreating. Her eyes remained fixed on Marco, with an intensity that seemed to transcend the natural wariness between wild animals and humans. Behind her, the smallest foal stumbled again, collapsing to its knees before struggling back up. That decided it for Marco. Whatever had brought this family of horses to their doorstep, the foals clearly needed water urgently. Military training emphasized quick decision-making. Overthinking could cost lives. He turned and walked back to the house. The story you're about to hear will touch your heart in ways you never imagined. What happened that dust-filled afternoon changed a veteran's life forever. Like, share, and don't forget to comment where you're watching from. Heat waves shimmered across the vast, empty landscape of Silverridge Valley as dust swirled in miniature. Tornadoes across the parched earth. The small town, on the edge of Nevada's high desert, rarely saw visitors outside of those passing through on their way to somewhere more promising. Here the mountains stood like ancient sentinels against an impossibly blue sky, and time seemed to move as slowly as the shadows creeping across the cracked earth. At the very outskirts of town, where civilization gradually surrendered to wilderness, stood a weathered ranch house with a wraparound porch. The paint had long since been scoured away by sandstorms and summer heat, leaving the wood silver gray and splintered in places. A battered American flag hung limply from a post, occasionally stirring when a rare breeze managed to find its way through the valley. Inside the ranch house, 7-year-old Lily Martinez sat cross-legged on the living room floor near the front window, her dark braids falling over her shoulders as she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the glass. The afternoon heat didn't bother her. Instead, it fascinated her. Each wave of heat rippling across the landscape transformed the distant mountains into dancing mirages that captivated her imagination. 1, 2, 3. She counted softly, timing the intervals between the dust devils that spun across their property. Her small fingers traced invisible patterns on the window pane, mimicking their spiral dance. That means the wind is changing, Lily whispered to herself, repeating the weather wisdom her grandfather had taught her before he passed. Lily's mother, Elena, appeared in the doorway that led to the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Worry lines creased her forehead as she watched her daughter sitting so still by the window. At 36, Elena's once smooth face had begun to show the marks of a hard life. Single motherhood, financial struggles, and the constant worry about her brother. "Lily, mi corazon, come away from there," she called. "It's too hot by the window and I need help setting the table. Your uncle will be home soon." Lily turned, her round face illuminated by the harsh sunlight streaming through the glass. "But, Mama, I'm watching for the wild horses. Tío Marco said they sometimes come near the property when it's very hot. They look for water." In the kitchen, Marco Vasquez chopped vegetables for a salad, his movements mechanical and precise. The knife hit the cutting board with military regularity, the sound echoing Lily's rhythmic counting at the window. At 34, Marco's face was handsome but weathered beyond his years. Deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His right sleeve hung empty, pinned neatly at the shoulder, a visual reminder of what the war had taken from him. "Let her be, Elena," Marco said, his voice soft but carrying the unmistakable authority that 4 tours in Afghanistan had instilled in him. "She's fine where she is. Besides, those Mustangs aren't likely to come around with this drought." He set down the knife and reached for his water glass, his left hand moving with the deliberate care of someone who had been forced to relearn the simplest tasks. Elena sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly at her brother's reassurance. I know, I just worry." She glanced back at Lily, who had returned to her vigil at the window. "She's so much like Papa, always watching, always noticing things the rest of us miss." "Not small, but observant," Marco replied with the ghost of a smile. "Just like her mother." The siblings had moved to this remote ranch 6 months ago, following Marco's medical discharge from the army. After losing his arm to an IED explosion, he had spent months in rehabilitation, fighting not just to regain his physical capabilities, but also to outrun the shadows that followed him from the battlefield. Elena, who had been struggling as a single mother in Phoenix after her husband left, didn't hesitate when Marco suggested they pool their resources and start fresh somewhere quiet. The ranch had been affordable precisely because no one wanted it. Too remote, too run down, too much work for most people. But for Marco, the endless space and isolation were exactly what he needed. And for Elena and Lily, it offered stability after years of uncertainty. Lily continued her vigil at the window, completely absorbed in her observation of the landscape. The afternoon heat had reached its peak, and the air inside the house was stifling despite the ancient ceiling fan that turned lazily overhead. The property stretched out before her, 30 acres of scrubland dotted with sagebrush and the occasional twisted juniper. Beyond their fence line, the land rose gradually toward the foothills, where, according to local legend, a herd of wild Mustangs still roamed free, descendants of horses that had escaped from Spanish explorers centuries ago. Marco had told her stories about these horses, how they were the embodiment of the American spirit, untamed and resilient. "They're survivors," he had explained one night as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Just like us, Princesa. They bend but don't break." Lunch in 15 minutes. Elena called from the kitchen, the aroma of her homemade tortilla soup filling the house, fighting against the oppressive heat. The recipe had been her grandmother's, passed down through generations, and cooking it always made their house feel more like home, no matter how recently they had moved in. "Okay, Mama," Lily answered absently, her attention still fixed on the shimmering horizon. Marco finished setting the table, placing Lily's favorite sun-patterned plate at her usual spot. His movements were slower than before his injury, but over the months he had developed a system for most household tasks. Occupational therapy had taught him practical adaptations, but it was his own stubborn determination that drove him to maintain as much independence as possible. "Hey, pequeña exploradora," he called to his niece. "Time to wash up soon." Lily nodded without turning from the window. She was about to stand when something caught her eye, a movement different from the swirling dust and heat mirages. She froze, narrowing her eyes to focus on the distant fence line where their property met the public land beyond. There it was again, something large moving slowly across the landscape. Not the mechanical movement of a vehicle, but the organic flow of living creatures. Lily pressed her face closer to the glass, her breath fogging the surface briefly before evaporating in the heat. "Tío Marco!" she called, excitement rising in her voice. "Tío Marco, come quick! I think I see them!" Marco set down the water pitcher he'd been filling, his brow furrowing. "See what, Lily?" "The horses. The wild horses are coming this way." Elena appeared in the doorway, concern etched on her face. Living in the desert had taught her caution. Unexpected visitors of any kind could spell trouble. "Marco, check what she's seeing, please." Marco crossed the room to join Lily at the window. He placed his hand on her shoulder and leaned down to follow her pointing finger. Through the heat-warped air, he could make out several shapes moving slowly toward their property. Not the sharp, angular silhouettes of vehicles, but the unmistakable fluid forms of horses, one larger figure in front and several smaller ones following behind. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, forgetting momentarily to watch his language around Lily. "You've got good eyes, pequeña. Those are horses all right?" Lily bounced excitedly, her braids swinging. "See, Mama, I told you they would come. Can we go outside and see them closer?" Elena joined them at the window, shading her eyes against the glare. "They're probably just passing through, looking for water. The creek on our property might still have some, even with the drought." Marco studied the approaching horses with increasing interest. As they drew nearer, details became clearer through the rippling heat. The lead horse was a mare, Palomino, with a blonde mane that caught the sunlight like spun gold. Behind her followed 3 foals, their coats varying from deep chestnut to a dappled grey. They moved with obvious fatigue, their heads lowered against the relentless sun. "They don't look good, Elena," Marco said quietly, so Lily wouldn't hear. "That mare is too thin, and she's favoring her right front leg. And those foals, they're dehydrated for sure." Elena's expression softened from concern to compassion. Like many who had grown up in the Southwest, she had a deep respect for the Mustangs. These living symbols of freedom had roamed these lands long before any of their ancestors had arrived. The drought has been hard on everything this year. As the small herd approached their fence line, Marco's trained eye noticed more details. The mare's coat, which should have gleamed like polished gold, was dull and matted in places. One of the foals, the smallest, stumbled occasionally, struggling to keep pace with its siblings. Despite her obvious exhaustion, the mare continuously circled back to nudge the struggling foal forward, never leaving it behind. "Mama, they need help," Lily said with the simple clarity of a child. "They look thirsty and tired." Marco nodded slowly. "The creek on our back property might still have some water, but they'd need to go around the fence to reach it." He frowned, considering. Strange, they'd come so close to the house though. Wild Mustangs usually avoid human dwellings. Elena watched the horses with growing concern. The mare had reached their fence line and stopped, the foals gathering close to her sides. Instead of continuing around the property toward the creek, she stood still, her head raised as if studying the house. "What's she doing?" Elena wondered aloud. Marco shook his head, puzzled. Years of military training had taught him to notice details others might miss, and something about the mare's behavior struck him as unusual. She wasn't acting like a typical wild horse encountering human territory. There was purpose in her stance, an almost deliberate quality to her stillness. The mare took several steps closer to the house, then stopped again, her ears pricked forward attentively. One of the foals, the dappled grey, whinnied softly, a sound that carried clearly across the still afternoon air. "She's looking at us," Lily whispered, wonder filling her voice. "She's looking right at us, Tío Marco." Marco felt a chill despite the heat. The mare was indeed looking toward the house, her gaze unnervingly direct. 15 years in the military had honed his instincts, and every one of them was telling him this wasn't normal wild horse behavior. Elena must have sensed it too. "Marco," she said quietly, "has anyone in town mentioned missing horses?" Could they be domesticated ones that escaped during the storm last week? Marco considered this. Jacobson over at the general store would have mentioned it. People around here keep track of each other's livestock. He continued to study the mare, who had taken another cautious step toward the house. No, these are Mustangs. Look at their build, leaner than ranch horses, and no signs of shoes or handling. The mare suddenly raised her head and let out a long, low whinny that seemed to hang in the hot, still air. The sound wasn't aggressive or frightened. It carried a quality that made Marco's skin prickle with recognition. It was a call for attention. Lily pressed her hands against the glass. She's asking for something, Tío. I think she wants us to help her. Lily, honey, wild horses don't ask humans for help, Elena said gently, though uncertainty tinged her voice. But Marco wasn't so sure. As a soldier, he had seen animals in war zones sometimes approach humans when desperate enough, usually for food, occasionally for help with injuries. Extreme circumstances could override natural caution. I'm going outside, he decided abruptly. Elena, stay here with Lily. What, Marco? No, those are wild animals. You don't know how they'll react, especially with the foals. Marco was already moving toward the door, his decision made. I'll keep my distance, but something's not right, and I need to see what's happening. I want to come too, Lily protested, jumping up from her spot by the window. No, pequeña, Marco said firmly. You stay with your mama. I'll be right back. Before Elena could argue further, Marco had stepped onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. The heat hit him like a physical wall, the air so dry it seemed to pull moisture from his skin with each breath. He stood motionless for a moment, allowing the horses to register his presence. The mare's reaction confirmed his suspicions that this was no ordinary encounter. Rather than startling or retreating at the sight of a human, she took several deliberate steps closer to the house, stopping about 30 yards away. The foals clustered behind her, the smallest one visibly trembling with exhaustion. Marco slowly descended the porch steps, moving with the deliberate calm he had used when approaching nervous civilians in war zones. Easy there, he murmured, though he knew his voice wouldn't carry meaning to the horse. What's brought you here, girl? The mare watched him intently, ears forward, body tense, but not fearful. Then, to Marco's astonishment, she pawed at the ground 3 times in quick succession before looking back up at him. The gesture seemed almost communicative. Inside the house, Lily and Elena watched through the window. Look, Mama, Lily whispered excitedly. She's talking to Tío. The mare took another step forward, then stopped, whinnying again, this time with more urgency. She turned slightly, revealing her right side more clearly, and Marco sucked in a breath. A long gash ran along her flank, not fresh but certainly recent, crusted with dried blood and desert dust. It wasn't life-threatening, but it explained the limping he had noticed earlier. You're hurt, he said softly, instinctively reaching out before catching himself. Wild horse or not, approaching an injured animal with foals was asking for trouble. The mare, however, held her ground, neither advancing nor retreating. Her eyes remained fixed on Marco with an intensity that seemed to transcend the natural wariness between wild animals and humans. Behind her, the smallest foal stumbled again, collapsing to its knees before struggling back up. That decided it for Marco. Whatever had brought this family of horses to their doorstep, the foals clearly needed water urgently. Military training emphasized quick decision-making. Overthinking could cost lives. He turned and walked back to the house. As Marco re-entered the house, Elena and Lily turned to him expectantly, questions written across their faces. We need to get water out there now, Marco said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he had used when commanding his platoon. Those foals are severely dehydrated, and the mare is injured. Elena hesitated, maternal caution battling with compassion. Marco, we don't know anything about wild horses. What if they're dangerous? They're not acting aggressive, Marco replied, already moving toward the kitchen. The mare is desperate, Elena. I've seen that look before, in people, in animals. She came here for a reason. Lily tugged at her mother's hand. Please, Mama, they need help. The littlest one keeps falling down. Marco filled a large plastic tub with water, his movements quick but measured. Years of military discipline had taught him efficiency, even with one arm. Lily, get those carrots from the refrigerator. Elena, do we still have that first aid kit from when I first came home? The one with the veterinary supplies for the chickens. Elena nodded, her resistance crumbling in the face of her brother's certainty and her daughter's pleading eyes. It's in the hall closet. But Marco, be careful. Wild animals can be unpredictable. When they're injured or protecting their young, Marco balanced the water tub against his hip, his singular hand gripping the rim securely. I'll keep my distance, but I'm not going to stand by and watch those foals collapse from dehydration. Not when we can help. Lily had already retrieved the carrots, clutching them to her chest like precious cargo. Can I come now, Tío? Please? I'll be super careful and do exactly what you say. Marco and Elena exchanged glances. Marco's expression softened slightly. Stay behind me at all times. If I tell you to go back inside, you don't argue. Understand? Lily nodded solemnly, her dark eyes wide. I promise. Elena sighed, recognizing defeat. I'll get the first aid kit and join you. We'll do this together. The small family stepped back out into the scorching afternoon heat. The mare remained where Marco had left her, though she had settled onto her haunches, clearly conserving her strength. The foals had clustered around her, two of them lying in the meager shade of her body, while the smallest one stood wobbling, its delicate legs trembling with exhaustion. Marco approached slowly, setting the water tub down about 15 yards from the horses. Easy does it, he murmured, using the same soothing tone he'd developed for calming frightened civilians during raids. We're here to help. The mare's ears flicked forward, her intelligent eyes tracking their movements. She rose to her feet with obvious effort, causing the foals to stir nervously. For a moment, Marco feared she might bolt, taking her vulnerable offspring with her. Instead, she nickered softly to the foals and took a hesitant step toward the water. That's it, girl, Marco encouraged, backing away to give her space. It's just water, you know what it is. The mare approached the tub cautiously, stretching her neck to sniff the water. After a moment's consideration, she began to drink deeply, her thirst overcoming any lingering wariness of human presence. The two stronger foals followed their mother's lead, crowding around the tub. The smallest one, however, remained where it had been seemingly too weak to make the journey. Lily watched with concern from behind Marco's protective stance. Tío, she whispered, the little one isn't coming. I think it's too tired. Marco nodded, his face grim. You're right, it's worse off than the others. Elena, who had joined them with the first aid kit, noticed the same thing. What can we do? It needs water, but it can't make it to the tub. Marco considered their options, drawing on years of field experience where resources were limited and lives hung in the balance. We need to bring water to it, but I don't want to spook the mare. As if understanding their dilemma, the mare raised her head from the water, droplets streaming from her muzzle. She looked directly at Lily, then turned to gaze at her struggling foal. The gesture was so deliberate that even Elena, the most skeptical among them, felt a chill run down her spine. She wants us to help the little one, Lily said with absolute certainty. I think you're right, Pequeña, Marco agreed, his military skepticism momentarily overridden by what he was witnessing. Elena, get the small bucket from the porch. Lily, stay with me. As Elena retrieved the bucket, Marco studied the mare more carefully. The injury on her flank needed cleaning, but it wasn't his primary concern. The foals, especially the smallest one, were in more immediate danger from dehydration. Desert heat could claim a young animal's life with frightening speed. Elena returned with the bucket, which Marco filled from the tub. I'm going to approach the foals slowly, he told them. Elena, keep watching the mare. If she shows any signs of aggression, we back off immediately. Look at her, Marco, Elena said softly. She's not afraid of us. That's not normal for a wild Mustang. The mare raised her head, meeting Marco's gaze with an intensity that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Then, with deliberate slowness, she turned her injured side toward him, as if displaying the wound. She wants our help, Lily whispered, voicing what they were all thinking. Marco nodded slowly. I think you're right, Pequeña. To Elena, he added, let's get the antiseptic from the first aid kit. We'll start with cleaning her wound, see how she reacts. Elena retrieved the supplies, her movements cautious, but no longer fearful. Talk to her, she suggested to Marco. Your voice is calming. Let her know what you're doing. Marco approached the mare with the same careful respect he might show to a wounded comrade. I'm going to help you, he said quietly, knowing the words meant nothing to the animal, but hoping his tone conveyed his intentions. This might sting a bit, but it'll help that cut heal properly. To his surprise, the mare stood perfectly still as he cleaned the long gash on her flank, flinching only slightly when the antiseptic made contact with the wound. Her behavior reminded Marco of the military horses he'd seen, animals trained to trust their handlers implicitly, even in painful or frightening situations. She's been around humans before, he concluded, applying a thin layer of antibiotic ointment to the wound. No wild horse would tolerate this kind of handling without training. But she doesn't have a brand, Elena observed, examining the mare more closely. And look at her hooves. They've never been shod. She's definitely not domestic. Maybe she was part of one of those Bureau of Land Management training programs, Marco suggested. They gentle some of the Mustangs, train them before adopting them out. Then why would she be back in the wild with foals? Elena countered, her brow furrowed in concentration as she gently cleaned the small foal's injured leg. And these foals are definitely wild-born. See how they move. That's not learned behavior from domestic horses. The mystery of the mare and her foals deepened as Marco and Elena worked to treat their injuries. Lily, having been given permission to approach now that the horses were calmer, sat cross-legged on the ground near the two stronger foals, who had ventured close enough to sniff curiously at her hair and clothes. This one is brave, she declared, carefully offering a piece of carrot to the chestnut foal with a white star on its forehead. And this one is curious. She nodded toward the solid bay foal that was investigating the pockets of her overalls. But the little gray one is special. Look how it watches everything. Marco glanced at the smallest foal, who was indeed observing the proceedings with unusual intensity for such a young animal. Its large, dark eyes seemed to take in every detail, assessing and understanding in a way that struck Marco as remarkably human. They all need names, Lily continued, warming to her subject. The brave one should be Valor, and the curious one can be Scout. She looked to the smallest foal, considering. The little gray one should be Spirit. Lily, Elena began gently, we can't name them. They're wild animals, not pets. But Marco found himself nodding in agreement with his niece. Names are good, especially if we're going to be caring for them until they recover. The mare needs one too. Lily's face lit up. Liberty, because she's free and strong like the soldiers. You commanded, Tío. Marco felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot that had resided there since his injury. Liberty, he repeated, tasting the name. It suits her. As the afternoon heat began to wane slightly, the small family continued to care for the horses. Marco refilled the water tub twice, noting with relief that all the foals, including the weakened Spirit, were drinking regularly. Elena fashioned a compress for Liberty's wound using supplies from the first aid kit, and Lily kept the foals occupied with small pieces of carrot and apple, earning their tentative trust through patience and gentleness. Marco moved with deliberate slowness, the small bucket of water held securely in his left hand. The mare tracked his movement, but made no aggressive move, continuing to drink while keeping her eyes on the human approaching her weakest offspring. Thou, small foal, a delicate dappled grey with a white blaze, watched Marco's approach with wide, dark eyes. It tried to rise from its seated position, but lacked the strength, its spindly legs buckling beneath it. "Easy, little one," Marco murmured, as he knelt beside the foal, setting the bucket down within its reach. "You need this water." The foal looked at Marco, then at the bucket, indecision clear in its posture. Behind them, the mare had stopped drinking and was watching intently, her body tense but not threatening. Lily, unable to contain herself any longer, took a small step forward. "It's scared, Tío. It doesn't know the water will help." Marco glanced back at his niece, torn between caution and acknowledging her insight. "Stay there, Lily. Let me try something." He dipped his fingers into the bucket and let water drip from them near the foal's muzzle. The scent of fresh water seemed to cut through the animal's fear. It stretched its neck forward and licked at Marco's wet fingers before finding the bucket and drinking eagerly. "It's working," Lily whispered excitedly. The mare, seeing her foal drinking, returned her attention to her own water source, though she continued to cast glances in their direction. The other two foals, having quenched their immediate thirst, began to explore the immediate area with cautious curiosity, never straying far from their mother. As the smallest foal drank, Marco gently ran his hand along its neck, feeling the heat radiating from its body and the trembling of its muscles. The foal didn't flinch from his touch, either too exhausted to care or already sensing this human meant no harm. "Elena," Marco said quietly, "this little one is in bad shape. Severely. Dehydrated and probably malnourished too. And look at this." He carefully lifted the foal's foreleg, revealing a raw, red area around the fetlock. "It's injured as well. Nothing too serious, but it needs cleaning and treatment." Elena knelt beside her brother, her initial fear giving way to professional assessment. Before becoming a stay-at-home mother, she had worked as a veterinary assistant. The mother's wound looks older, but this is fresh. Maybe from the storm last week. Flash floods could have separated them from their herd, forced them to cross rougher terrain than usual. "Can we help them, Mama?" Lily asked, still maintaining her promised distance, but leaning forward eagerly. Elena studied the mare, who had finished drinking and was now watching them with her foal. Under normal circumstances, wild Mustangs avoided humans at all costs. Their approach to the house, and the mare's apparent willingness to allow humans near her offspring, defied natural behavior. "They need more than just water," Elena acknowledged reluctantly. "The little one especially. But they're wild animals, Lily. Once they're stronger, they'll return to the mountains." Marco wasn't so certain. There was something about the mare's demeanor, a deliberate quality to her actions, that reminded him of the working horses he'd encountered in Afghanistan. Those horses had been intelligent, purposeful animals that understood their relationship with humans. This mare seemed to be demonstrating a similar awareness. "Let's take things one step at a time," he suggested. "First, we need to treat their injuries and make sure they're all properly hydrated. Then we can figure out what to do next." The mare, as if sensing she was being discussed, took several steps toward them. Marco tensed instinctively, placing himself between the approaching horse and Elena and Lily. But the mare showed no aggression. She simply lowered her head to nuzzle her foal, who had finally stopped drinking. "They should be in shade," Elena said eventually, wiping sweat from her forehead. "This heat is brutal, even with water. The barn would be ideal. It's cool in there, and we have hay." Marco considered this. Getting wild horses into a barn won't be easy. They've accepted our help, but confinement is different. "We could leave the doors open," Lily suggested. so they know they can leave whenever they want. Marco and Elena exchanged glances, silently weighing the risks and benefits. Finally, Marco nodded. It's worth trying. The little one especially needs to get out of this sun. With slow, patient movements, they began encouraging the horses toward the small barn that sat about 50 yards from the main house. Liberty seemed to understand their intentions, following Marco's gentle guidance with surprising willingness. The foals stayed close to their mother, their initial wariness of the humans giving way to cautious acceptance. The barn was built for horses originally, Marco explained to Lily as they walked. Old man Harrison used to breed quarter horses here before he lost the place. It hasn't been used in years, but the structure is sound, and there's still some basic equipment inside. The barn was a simple structure with weathered wooden sides and a metal roof that gleamed dully in the late afternoon sun. Inside, it was noticeably cooler, the thick walls providing a buffer against the desert heat. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the high windows, and the smell of old hay and wood filled the space. Marco and Elena worked together to prepare a space for the horses, spreading fresh straw they found in a storage area and placing buckets of clean water within easy reach. Liberty entered the barn cautiously, her ears flicking back and forth as she assessed this new environment. The foals followed, Valor and Scout with curious eagerness, Spirit with more hesitation. See, it's nice and cool in here, Lily told them, speaking to the horses as if they could understand every word. And there's water and shade and no mean sun to make you hot and tired. To the adults' surprise, the horses seemed to settle into the barn environment quickly, Liberty leading her foals to the freshly prepared area and allowing them to lie down in the clean straw. Spirit, still the weakest, collapsed gratefully into the bedding, while the other two explored their new surroundings with typical foal curiosity. They're exhausted, Elena observed, watching as Liberty positioned herself protectively near her offspring. They must have traveled a long way to get here. Marco nodded, his military mind automatically calculating possibilities. From the Sierra foothills, most likely. That's where the largest Mustang herds are in this region. But that's 30 miles at least, over rough terrain. With foals this young and one injured, that's a desperate journey. But why come here, Elena wondered. Why seek out humans at all? Marco had no answer, but as he watched Liberty settle into the straw, her vigilant gaze never leaving her foals, he was struck by the parallel to his own journey. He too had traveled a great distance, wounded and desperate, seeking a safe haven. And like Liberty, he had found it in this remote desert ranch, alongside family who needed him as much as he needed them. "We should get back to the house," he said finally. "It's getting late and we all need to eat. We can check on them after dinner, bring more water and some feed." Elena nodded, gathering the first aid supplies. "Will they stay, do you think?" With the barn doors open, Marco looked at Liberty, who was watching them with those intelligent, knowing eyes. "I think they'll stay as long as they need to," he replied. "They came here for a reason." The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the barn's high windows, casting golden squares on the straw-covered floor. Marco had risen before dawn, driven by a sense of responsibility that had been ingrained during his military years. He'd slipped out of the house quietly, leaving Elena and Lily still sleeping, and made his way to the barn with fresh water and feed. He paused at the entrance, struck by the peaceful tableau before him. Liberty lay in the straw, with her foals nestled against her, their small bodies rising and falling with the steady rhythm of sleep. The mare lifted her head at his approach, ears forward in recognition rather than alarm. There was no fear in her eyes, only a calm acknowledgement of his presence. "Good morning," Marco said softly, setting down the buckets of water and feed. "How are our patients doing today?" Liberty nickered softly in response, a sound that seemed almost conversational. She rose gracefully to her feet, careful not to disturb the still sleeping foals, and approached Marco with surprising confidence. The change in her demeanor from the previous day was remarkable. Where before there had been desperate need, now there was something that looked very much like trust. Marco checked her wound, pleased to find the inflammation had already subsided. "You're healing well," he told her, gently applying more antibiotic ointment. Liberty stood perfectly still during the treatment, her intelligent eyes following his movements. The smallest foal, Spirit, stirred in the straw, blinking awake with delicate sweeps of long lashes. Unlike yesterday when standing had seemed an impossible effort, the little grey foal rose steadily to its feet and stretched. The night of rest, water and safety had clearly done wonders for its condition. "Well, look at you," Marco said with genuine pleasure. "Feeling better this morning, aren't you?" Spirit approached him without hesitation, sniffing curiously at his pockets where he'd stashed a few carrot pieces. Marco laughed, a sound that surprised him with its ease. When was the last time he had laughed so freely? Since returning from his final tour, joy had been in short supply. "All right, I get the hint," he chuckled, retrieving a carrot piece and offering it on his flat palm, the way Elena had shown Lily. As the other foals began to wake, Marco went about his self-appointed morning duties. He refreshed their water, spread some alfalfa hay that he'd found in the barn's storage area, and checked each animal for signs of improvement or decline. His methodical approach, assess, analyze, act, was second nature after years of military service, but there was something different about applying these skills to care for these unexpected visitors. "You're looking at me like you know something." "I don't," he told Liberty, who watched his every move with those discerning eyes. "What's your story, girl? Where did you come from, and why did you bring your babies here?" Liberty simply continued her steady gaze, offering no answers, but somehow making Marco feel understood. It was an odd sensation, being seen by an animal in a way he hadn't felt seen by humans in a long time. Not since the explosion that had taken his arm had anyone looked at him with such clear-eyed acceptance, without pity or discomfort. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Marco from his thoughts. Lily's voice called out from outside. "Tío Marco, are you in there?" "Come in, pequeña," he answered. "Our friends are awake." Lily burst into the barn with all the exuberance of her 7 years, though she remembered to move slowly once inside, careful not to startle the horses. Her eyes were wide with delight at seeing the foals up and active. "They look so much better," she exclaimed, keeping her voice soft despite her excitement. "Can I give them the apples Mama sent?" Marco nodded, watching as Lily carefully approached the foals, offering small apple pieces on her outstretched palm, just as they had practiced. Scout, true to the name she had given him, was the first to accept the offering, followed by Valor. Spirit hung back slightly, still the most cautious of the three. But hunger eventually overcame wariness, and soon all 3 foals were eating. From Lily's hand. "They remember me," Lily said with wonder. "They're not scared anymore." "Animals know when they can trust someone," Marco replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "They sense kindness." Elena appeared in the doorway, carrying a thermos of coffee and some breakfast wrapped in cloth. Her skepticism from yesterday had softened as she took in the scene before her. "I thought we could have breakfast out here," she said, setting down the food on a bale of straw. "How are they this morning?" "Much better," Marco reported, accepting the cup of coffee she poured for him. "The mare's wound is already showing signs of healing, and the foals are more energetic. Even the little one is stronger today." Elena knelt to examine Spirit's injured leg, her experienced hands gentle but thorough. "The swelling is down," she noted with satisfaction, "and look how she's putting weight on it now. Yesterday she could barely stand." "She?" Marco questioned. Elena nodded. "I checked all of them while you were getting water. Valor and Scout are colts, but Spirit is a filly." Lily beamed at this information. "A girl! I knew she was special." As they shared their simple breakfast, the horses moved around the barn with increasing confidence, exploring their temporary shelter. Liberty seemed particularly interested in the tack hanging on the far wall, old bridles and halters left behind by the previous owner. "She's definitely been handled before," Elena observed, following Marco's gaze to where the mare was nosing at a worn leather halter. "The question is, by whom? And what happened to separate her from whoever trained her?" Marco had been pondering the same questions. "I'm going to ride into town today," he decided. "Talk to Sheriff Mendez and see if anyone's reported missing horses. Maybe check with the BLM office about recent roundups or adoption programs." "Can I stay here with the horses?" Lily asked immediately. Elena hesitated. "They seem gentle enough." "No, but they're still wild animals, mi corazon. I'll be careful," Lily promised. "I won't go inside their stall or try to ride them or anything. I just want to keep them company." Marco and Elena exchanged glances, their silent communication perfected over months of rebuilding their lives together. Finally, Elena nodded. "You can stay in the barn while I work in the garden, but you come check in with me every 30 minutes, and no going into their space without me or Tío Marco present." Lily agreed solemnly to these conditions, clearly willing to accept any terms that allowed her to remain with her newfound friends. After finishing their breakfast, Marco prepared for the journey into town. Silverridge was a small community, just a handful of buildings clustered around a main street, but it was nearly 5 miles from the ranch, a significant ride in the desert heat. He saddled Dante, the steady gelding that had come with the property, and filled his canteen with fresh water. "I'll be back by mid-afternoon," he told Elena as he mounted up. "Keep an eye on the little one especially. She's improved, but she's still weaker than the others." Elena nodded, handing him a package of food for the journey. "Be careful. And Marco," she hesitated, then continued, "maybe don't mention to everyone in town that we've taken in wild Mustangs. You know how some people around here feel about them." Marco understood her caution. In ranching communities like Silverridge, opinions about wild horses were deeply divided. Some viewed them as living symbols of American heritage, while others saw them as competitors for scarce grazing land and water resources. Emotions ran high on both sides. "I'll be discreet," he promised, touching the brim of his hat in a farewell gesture before turning Dante toward the road that led to town. The ride gave Marco time to think, something he'd both craved and dreaded since his return from Afghanistan. In the busy work of rehabilitation and then setting up the ranch with Elena, he'd managed to keep the darker thoughts at bay. But alone on the trail, with only the steady rhythm of Dante's hooves for company, memories had a way of surfacing. Today, however, his mind kept returning to Liberty and her foals, to the mystery they presented. What forces had driven a wild mare to seek human help? How had she known to come to their particular doorstep? The questions circled in his mind, providing a welcome alternative to the usual haunting images of his final deployment. Silverridge appeared on the horizon, a small cluster of buildings shimmering in the heat. Despite its modest size, the town served as the central hub for ranchers and farmers spread across the surrounding valley. The main street consisted of a general store, a small diner, the sheriff's office, a post office, and a feed and supply store. On the outskirts stood a small church and a one-room schoolhouse that served the scattered families of the region. Marco tied Dante to the hitching post outside the general store, patting the horse's neck before heading inside. The bell above, the door jingled as he entered, announcing his arrival to the few customers browsing the shelves. Bill Jacobson, the proprietor, looked up from his newspaper and broke into a wide smile. "Marco Vasquez, twice in 1 week. Must be some kind of record. What brings you into town so soon?" Marco approached the counter, returning the greeting with a nod. "Need some information, Bill? Wondered if you'd heard anything about missing." Horses in the area, maybe from one of the ranches, or perhaps something passing through BLM channels? Jacobson scratched his beard thoughtfully. Can't say that I have. Johnson lost a heifer last week to a mountain lion, but no horses reported missing. Why do you ask? Marco chose his words carefully, mindful of Elena's caution. Just curious. Thought I saw some tracks near our property line yesterday. Probably nothing. Could be feral Mustangs, offered a voice from the corner of the store. Charlie Welch, one of the larger cattle ranchers in the area, rose from where he'd been examining. Work gloves. They've been moving down from the highlands with this drought. Drinking water meant for legitimate stock. Marco felt a flicker of irritation at Welch's tone, but kept his expression neutral. Maybe so. Have there been more Mustang sightings than usual? Welch spat into a nearby trash can. Too many if you ask me. BLM's supposed to be managing their numbers, but they're spreading out all over, causing nothing but trouble. They were here before the cattle, remarked Sarah Runningbird, the elderly postmistress who had entered the store unnoticed. Her Native American heritage was evident in her high cheekbones and the traditional silver jewelry that adorned her neck and ears. The Mustangs belong to this land in a way that's different from domesticated animals. Welch scoffed, but didn't directly challenge Sarah, who was respected throughout the community for her wisdom and deep knowledge of the area's history and natural resources. Sarah turned to Marco with a penetrating gaze. The horses found you, didn't they? Marco blinked in surprise. How did you... I know things, she replied simply. The old ones talked to me. They told me a Palomino mare with 3 foals was seeking help. A chill ran down Marco's spine despite the store's warmth. He hadn't mentioned Liberty's coloring or the number of foals to anyone in town. They came yesterday, he confirmed quietly. The mare is injured and the foals were dehydrated. We're giving them water and shelter until they recover. Sarah nodded, as if this was exactly what she expected to hear. She chose your property for a reason. The Mustangs remember kindness through generations. What do you mean? Marco asked, aware that Jacobson and Welch were listening to the exchange with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. Liberty approached from across the corral, her golden coat catching the light. The wound on her flank had healed completely, leaving only a faint scar as testament to whatever ordeal she had endured before finding them. She stopped beside Marco, lowering her head in greeting. He still marveled at how the wild mare had chosen to trust him from the beginning, how she had looked at him with those knowing eyes that saw past his missing arm to the man beneath. In her presence, he never felt broken or incomplete, only accepted exactly as he was. The rumors of Pike's associates had faded after the man received a lengthy federal sentence. The additional security measures remained, but the sense of immediate threat had dissipated, allowing a new rhythm to emerge at the ranch. Elena had reduced her clinic hours to spend more time working with the horses. Lily had blossomed, her natural affinity for the animals drawing out confidence and responsibility beyond her years. And Marco had found something he'd thought lost forever in the dust and violence of war: purpose, connection, and a slowly healing spirit. Dr. Cheney called, Elena said, breaking into his thoughts. She's bringing some BLM officials tomorrow for the final foster review. Marco nodded, unsurprised. They had known this day was coming, the day when bureaucracy would determine whether Liberty and her foals could stay permanently or would be relocated to another facility. Do you think they'll let us keep them? Lily asked, leading Spirit over to join them. I hope so, Pequeña, Marco replied, though he knew the decision would ultimately rely on factors beyond their control. That evening, as sunset painted the desert in gold and crimson, Marco returned to the barn alone. Liberty stood at the stall door, watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Tomorrow's the day, he told her softly, when they decide if this is truly your home now. Liberty nickered softly, stretching her neck to nudge his shoulder. The gesture reminded him so vividly of Blackwood's journal entry. When I look into her eyes, I see no judgment for my damaged body, no pity for the nightmares that haunt my sleep. She sees me as I am, not as what the war has left of me. Marco understood now what the veteran from another war had discovered on this same land, that sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected sources, and that freedom isn't just about roaming wild across the desert, but about finding where you truly belong. The next morning, as the BLM officials arrived to make their assessment, Marco watched Liberty gather her foals around her. Their eyes met across the corral, and in that moment of silent communication, he knew with certainty what Sarah Runningbird had meant. Some connections transcend time, some choices echo across generations, and some wounds, whether in horses or humans, can only heal when the right souls find each other. Whatever the officials decided, the Golden Mare had already completed her mission. She had chosen her sanctuary and found her people, continuing a cycle of healing that had begun a century before with another wounded warrior and another Golden Mare on this same desert land. The Mustangs had come home, and in welcoming them, Marco had finally come home too. If this heartwarming story of a veteran finding healing through an extraordinary connection with a Mustang mare and her foals touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Each week, we bring you inspiring tales that reveal the powerful bonds between humans and animals. Stories that remind us how healing can come from the most unexpected places. Click the subscribe button below and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that second chances and new beginnings are always possible, even in the most challenging circumstances. And don't forget to comment below, telling us where you're watching from. We love connecting with our global community of animal lovers and storytellers. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most profound healing happens when two wounded souls find each other. The thought made Marco's stomach turn. And this pike might be in our area? As Marco rode back toward the ranch, the leather-bound journal from Sarah Runningbird seemed to weigh more than its physical presence in his saddlebag. The old woman's certainty about Liberty seeking them out specifically had unsettled him. In Afghanistan, Marco had learned to trust his instincts. Right now, those instincts were telling him that there was more to the Mustang's appearance than mere coincidence. The sun had begun its westward descent by the time the ranch came into view. Marco scanned the property with the vigilance that had become second nature during his tours of duty. Everything appeared normal. The house stood peaceful in the afternoon light, Elena's truck parked beside it, the garden visible with its rows of struggling vegetables. But as he approached the barn, Marco noticed something that made him tighten his grip on the reins. The barn doors stood wide open, which wasn't unusual given the arrangements they'd made for the horses. What caught his attention was a flash of movement inside. Too large to be Elena or Lily, too solid to be one of the horses. Someone else was in there. Marco slowed Dante to a walk, his senses heightened. He dismounted a good distance from the barn, tying the gelding to a fence post. Moving with the silent precision he'd perfected in combat situations, he approached from an angle that would keep him out of sight of anyone inside. A man's voice drifted from the barn, unfamiliar, rough-edged. "Easiest money we'll make all year. Mare like that will fetch premium across the border. Foals too, once they're weaned." Marco's blood ran cold. He flattened himself against the exterior wall of the barn, listening intently. A second voice answered the first, lower but equally mercenary. "Boss said no delays. Get them loaded today. The woman and kids shouldn't be a problem if they show up." Anger surged through Marco, mingling with fear for his family. Where were Elena and Lily? His hand instinctively moved to his hip, where his service weapon would have been, finding only empty air. Since returning to civilian life, he'd kept his Beretta locked in a safe in the house. Marco edged closer to the open door, risking a glimpse inside. Two men stood near the stalls where Liberty and her foals had been housed. One was tall and lean with a weathered face and a faded denim jacket. The other was shorter, stockier, wearing a dusty cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. Both had the hard look of men who made their living outside the law. The taller man was securing a rope halter around Liberty's neck. The mare was resistant, tossing her head and backing away as far as the stall would allow. In the corner, the three foals huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. Spirit, the smallest, was trembling visibly. "Damn horse," the man growled, yanking roughly on the rope. "Settle down or I'll make you regret it." Liberty's distress was evident, but more disturbing was the absence of Elena and Lily. Marco scanned the barn interior again, relief washing over him when he saw no sign of them. They must still be at the house, unaware of the intruders. He needed a weapon, needed to get to the house, needed to alert the sheriff. But he couldn't leave Liberty and the foals with these men. Their intentions were clear. They were horse thieves, likely the illegal trappers Sheriff Mendez had mentioned. A plan formed rapidly in Marco's mind. He slipped around to the back of the barn, where a small door led to the storage area. If he could enter unseen, he might be able to create a distraction, buy enough time to get Liberty and the foals away from the thieves. The rear door creaked slightly as Marco eased it open. He froze, listening for any indication that the men had heard, but their conversation continued uninterrupted. They were arguing now about the best way to transport the foals. Marco moved silently through the storage area, past stacked hay bales and old equipment. He needed something he could use as a weapon, not to kill, but to disable if necessary. His eyes landed on a heavy pitchfork leaning against the wall. He grabbed it with his left hand, the weight familiar and reassuring, peering through a gap. Between stored equipment, Marco assessed the situation. The tall man was still struggling with Liberty, who continued to resist the halter. The stocky man had moved toward the foals, attempting to corral them into a portable pen they'd brought with them. A truck must be nearby, Marco realized. These men hadn't walked here. That raised another concern. Were there more of them? He couldn't assume these two were working alone. The decision of how to proceed was taken from him when a familiar voice called from outside the barn. "Tío Marco, are you back?" Lily's voice, high and clear, echoed across the yard. Both men froze, looking toward the barn entrance. "Damn it," the stocky one muttered. "I thought you said they'd be gone longer." The taller man released Liberty's halter, reaching instead for something tucked into his waistband. The glint of metal confirmed Marco's fear. A gun. "Shut her up," the man ordered. His companion, quick and quiet. Marco's protective instincts exploded into action. He burst from his hiding place, pitchfork held before him like a spear. "Lily, run," he shouted. "Get your mother and call the sheriff." The men whirled in surprise. The taller one raised his weapon, but Liberty chose that moment to rear up, striking. Out with her front hooves. The blow caught the man's shoulder, sending him staggering backward, his shot going wild into the rafters. The chaos was instantaneous. The foals bolted from their corner, darting between the men's legs. The stocky thief cursed as Scout knocked him off balance. Marco lunged forward with the pitchfork, using the handle to sweep the fallen gun away from the taller man's reach. "Lily, run," Marco shouted again, hoping his niece had heeded his first warning. He couldn't see the barn entrance from his position, couldn't know if she was safe. The taller man recovered quickly, drawing a knife from his boot. "You're making a mistake, friend," he snarled. "These are just animals, not worth dying over." "They're not yours to take," Marco replied, keeping the pitchfork between them. His military training was evident in his stance, balanced and ready despite his missing arm. The man laughed harshly. "What are you going to do, one-armed soldier? Take us. Both on? Before Marco could respond, a commotion erupted from the barn entrance. Lily's voice rang out, high with determination. Liberty, valor, scout, spirit, this way. Both thieves turned at the sound, momentarily distracted. It was all the opportunity Liberty needed. With a powerful kick, she broke through the weakened stall door and charged toward the barn entrance, her foals instinctively following. Marco seized the moment, driving forward with the pitchfork. He caught the taller man's jacket with the tines, pinning him against a support post. The stocky thief lunged at Marco, but years of hand-to-hand combat training took over. Even with one arm, Marco was dangerous. He pivoted, releasing the pitchfork, and using the man's momentum to send him crashing into a stack of hay bales. A shotgun blast from outside froze everyone in place. Next one goes lower. Elena's voice carried into the barn, steel beneath her controlled tone. Step away from my brother. Marco had never been so glad to hear his sister's voice. The taller thief, still pinned by the pitchfork, raised his hands slowly in surrender. His companion struggled to his feet amidst the fallen hay bales, cursing, but similarly yielding. Elena appeared in the doorway, her grandfather's shotgun held with the competence of someone raised in ranch country. Behind her, Lily stood with the horses, her small hand resting reassuringly on Liberty's neck. I called Sheriff Mendez, Elena said, her eyes never leaving the thieves. He's on his way. Marco, are you hurt? I'm fine, Marco assured her, though his heart was still racing. He moved to retrieve the fallen gun, tucking it safely into his belt. These men were trying to steal Liberty and the foals, planning to sell them across the border. The taller thief spat on the ground. They're just Mustangs. Government's rounding them up anyway. Not for slaughter, Marco countered, his voice hard. He turned to Elena. Where were you and Lily? At the house, Elena explained. The shotgun, still trained on the thieves. I was canning vegetables from the garden. Lily was supposed to be helping me, but she said she felt something was wrong with the horses. Marco glanced at his niece with newfound respect. Lily met his gaze steadily, her young face solemn. I just knew, she said simply, like when you know it's going to rain before the clouds come. I could feel they were scared. The sound of a vehicle approaching drew their attention. Moments later, Sheriff Mendez appeared in the doorway, his hand resting on his holstered sidearm. He took in the scene with a professional's efficiency. Looks like you've had some excitement. Vasquez, he observed dryly, these two giving you trouble? Caught them trying to steal the horses, Marco confirmed. They're armed. The tall one fired a shot. Mendez nodded, drawing his weapon. Harlan Pike, he said, addressing the taller man. Thought I recognized the description. You're a long way from Nevada. Pike's face darkened. I'm just making a living. A sheriff, by stealing protected Mustangs. Mendez shook his head as he handcuffed Pike. That's federal time. Your buddy here too. As the sheriff secured the second man, Marco moved to check on Lily and the horses. Liberty stood protectively near the foals, her body tense, but her eyes fixed trustingly on Marco. She allowed him to approach, lowering her head to nudge his shoulder gently. You're safe now, he told her softly. All of you. Lily looked up at him, her expression uncharacteristically serious. They were going to hurt them, weren't they, Tío? Marco hesitated, then nodded. There was no point sheltering her from the truth she had already intuited. Yes, but you stopped them. You saved Liberty and her babies. Lily's face brightened slightly. We all did. Liberty fought too. Marco couldn't argue with that assessment. Without the mayor's well-timed kick, things might have ended very differently. Sheriff Mendez approached after securing the thieves in his patrol car. I'll need statements from all of you, he said. But first, you want to tell me how you ended up harboring these Mustangs in the first place? Marco related the events of the previous day. Liberty's appearance at their property, the foals' dehydration, their decision to provide temporary shelter. Mendez listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. "I should report this to BLM," he said when Marco finished. "Technically, those are protected Mustangs under federal jurisdiction." Elena stepped forward, the shotgun now lowered, but still in her hands. "They came to us for help, Sheriff. The little one wouldn't have survived without intervention." Mendez sighed, looking over at the horses. The foals had settled somewhat, though they stayed close to their mother. Spirit, the smallest, watched. The humans with those intelligent eyes that seemed too knowing for a young animal. "Look," Mendez said finally, "I'll have to file a report, but I can note that you're providing emergency care to injured wildlife. That buys you some time before BLM gets involved." "Thank you," Marco said sincerely. "Don't thank me yet," Mendez cautioned. "Pike works with a network. His associates might come looking when he doesn't return." The implication was clear. The danger hadn't passed entirely. Marco nodded his understanding. "We'll be careful." After taking their statements and promising to return the next day with updates, Sheriff Mendez departed with his prisoners. The sound of the patrol car faded into the distance, leaving an unnatural quiet over the ranch. "What happens now?" Lily asked, her small hand still resting on Liberty's neck. Marco exchanged glances with Elena. "Now, we make sure the horses are safe for the night, and tomorrow I need to read something important." Later that evening, after securing the barn and checking that all the horses were settled, Marco sat at the kitchen table with Thomas Blackwood's journal open before him. The leather cover was worn smooth with age, the pages yellow and brittle. He handled it carefully, aware of its historical significance. Elena sat across from him, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. Lily had finally been persuaded to go to bed, though only after extracting a promise that she could help with the horses first thing in the morning. "So, Sarah Running Bird just gave this to you?" Elena asked, eyeing the journal curiously. Marco nodded, turning a page with care. "Said it belonged on this land, that Blackwood was a veteran who protected Mustangs here after the First World War. And she knew about Liberty and the Foals without you telling her," Elena added, her skepticism evident. "That's quite a coincidence." "Maybe," Marco conceded. "Or maybe there's more to this than we understand." He found an entry dated June 17th, 1919, and began to read aloud. "Today the golden mare returned with her new foal. She remembers me, though nearly a year has passed since I treated her leg wound. These wild ones have longer memories than most men give them credit for. The mare's trust is a balm to my fractured spirit. When I look into her eyes, I see no judgment for my damaged body, no pity for the nightmares that haunt my sleep. She sees me as I am, not as what the war has left of me." Marco paused, the parallels to his own situation striking him deeply. He continued reading, "The locals think me strange for protecting the Mustangs. They see only competition for grazing land, threats to their livestock. They cannot understand that these creatures represent something essential: freedom, resilience, the wild spirit that defined this land before we carved our boundaries upon it. In saving them, I begin to save myself." Elena was silent, watching her brother's face as he read. She had seen the changes in him since Liberty's arrival, subtle shifts in his demeanor, moments of connection that pierced the isolation he had wrapped around himself since returning from war. "There's more," Marco said, turning carefully to a later entry. "Listen to this, December 3rd, 1919. The golden mare led her herd to safety today as hunters pursued them across the North Valley. Her intelligence continues to astonish me. She seems to understand boundaries, leading the others along my property line where they cannot be legally shot. I've begun to wonder if there isn't something more to these animals than science can explain, some deeper knowing passed through generations." The Paiute elder, White Feather, visited today. He tells me the Mustangs carry the spirits of warriors, that they choose their human allies with purpose. I'm not a superstitious man, but after what I've witnessed, I find myself open to possibilities I would have dismissed in my former life. Morning arrived with the soft glow of dawn spreading across the desert landscape. Marco had slept fitfully, his dreams filled with images from Blackwood's journal intertwined with memories of Afghanistan. He rose before the sun fully crested the distant mountains, his military habits persisting despite years of civilian life. The kitchen was quiet as he brewed coffee, the familiar ritual grounding him in the present moment. Through the window, he could see the barn where Liberty and her foals had spent the night. After yesterday's confrontation with the horse thieves, Marco had reinforced the doors and added makeshift alarms, tin cans strung on wire that would rattle if disturbed. Elena joined him as he poured his first cup, her hair still tousled from sleep. "Did you rest at all?" she asked, reaching for the coffee pot. Marco shrugged. "Enough." He didn't mention the dreams, the way Blackwood's words about the golden mare had echoed in his subconscious. "I'm going to check on the horses." "I'll come." "With you," Elena said. "Let Lily sleep a little longer. Yesterday was intense for her." They walked to the barn in companionable silence, the desert air cool against their skin. Birds called from the scattered junipers, and a jackrabbit darted across their path, startling into motion at their approach. Inside, Liberty greeted them with a soft nicker, her head rising alertly from where she had been dozing beside her foals. The young ones stirred at her movement, Scout being the first to scramble to his feet with characteristic curiosity. "Good morning to you too," Marco said, approaching the stall with slow, deliberate movements. It still amazed him how quickly these wild creatures had adapted to human presence, especially Liberty, who watched him now with what could only be described as recognition. Elena moved to check Spirit, the smallest foal who had caused them the most concern. "She's looking stronger," she observed, kneeling to examine the filly's once injured leg. "Amazing what a couple days of proper care can do," Marco nodded, filling the water troughs while observing Liberty's interaction with Elena. The mare showed no fear, allowing Elena to check each of her foals with the patient demeanor of a domestic. "Horse accustomed to human handling, what do you make of Blackwood's journal?" Marco asked finally, voicing the question that had followed him into his dreams. Elena straightened, brushing straw from her jeans. "It's an interesting historical account," she said carefully. "The man clearly formed a bond with the wild horses." "It's more than that," Marco insisted. "The parallels are too exact to be coincidence. A golden mare with an injury, seeking out a wounded veteran on exactly the same property, a century apart. What are you suggesting? That Liberty is somehow connected to Blackwood's mare from 1919? Elena's tone was skeptical, but not dismissive. Marco leaned against the stall door, watching as Liberty nudged Scout away from investigating a loose board. "I don't know," he admitted, but Sarah Runningbird seemed to think so. She knew things she couldn't have known, about Liberty's coloring, about the three foals. "Native wisdom has different ways of understanding the world," Eleanor acknowledged. "My patients at the clinic on the reservation often saw connections where Western medicine sees coincidence." Before Marco could respond, the sound of a vehicle approaching drew their attention. It was too early for casual visitors, and Sheriff Mendez had said he wouldn't return until afternoon. Marco's body tensed instinctively, combat reflexes taking over. "Stay here," he told Elena, moving swiftly to the barn entrance. He peered out cautiously, ready to confront whoever had arrived. A government-issue SUV with Bureau of Land Management markings was pulling up to the house. Two people emerged, a tall man in a ranger uniform and a younger woman in civilian clothes carrying a tablet. "BLM," Marco informed Elena, his voice low. "Mendez must have filed his report already." "What do we do?" Elena asked, moving to stand beside her brother. "We can't hide 4 horses. We tell the truth," Marco decided. They came to us for help. We provided emergency care. According to Mendez, that's within our rights. They walked out to meet the officials, who had spotted them, emerging from the barn and were now heading in their direction. "Good morning," the ranger called as they approached. "I'm Ken Reeves with the Bureau of Land Management, and this is Dr. Miranda Cheney, our wildlife veterinarian. We're here about a report of Mustangs on your property." Marco stepped forward, offering his hand. "Marco Vasquez, this is my sister, Elena. Yes, we've been caring for an injured mare and 3 foals for the past couple of days." Dr. Cheney stepped forward, her expression professional but kind. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with sun-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that reflected intelligence and compassion. "Sheriff Mendez contacted us about the incident yesterday," she said. "He mentioned one of the foals was in poor condition when they arrived. How is it doing now?" "Much better," Elena answered. "The mare had a laceration on her flank, and the smallest foal, a filly, had an injured leg and was severely dehydrated. They've responded well to basic care. May we see them?" Dr. Cheney asked. Marco nodded, leading the officials into the barn. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would they insist on taking Liberty and her foals immediately? The thought created an unexpected tightness in his chest. Liberty watched the newcomers with alert wariness, placing herself between the visitors and her foals. The protective gesture wasn't lost on Dr. Cheney, who stopped at a respectful distance. "Beautiful Palomino," she commented, "and the foals look to be about 3 months old, a bit young to be traveling such a distance in this drought." She turned to Marco. "Sheriff Mendez said they approached your property directly. That's unusual behavior for a wild band." "Very unusual," Ranger Reeves agreed, his expression thoughtful as he observed the horses. "Mustangs typically avoid human contact, especially when they have young foals." Marco exchanged a glance with Elena. "We were surprised too, but the mare seemed determined, almost like she was seeking us out specifically." Dr. Cheney raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. Mind if I examine them? They're still somewhat skittish with strangers," Elena cautioned. "I'll be careful," the veterinarian assured them, removing a stethoscope from her bag. To everyone's surprise, Liberty allowed Dr. Cheney to approach after only a moment's hesitation. The mare stood still as the veterinarian conducted a gentle examination, checking her wound, heart rate, and overall condition. "Someone's treated this laceration properly," Dr. Cheney noted, inspecting Liberty's healing flank. "Clean, no infection setting in." "My sister has veterinary assistant experience," Marco explained. Dr. Cheney moved on to examine each foal, her experienced hands gentle but thorough. When she reached Spirit, she spent extra time checking the filly's leg and hydration levels. "This little one was in real trouble," she concluded, straightening up. "Another day without water in this heat, and she likely wouldn't have made it. You saved her life with your intervention." A small voice spoke from the barn entrance. "I told you. She was special." They all turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her dark hair disheveled from sleep. She approached without fear, moving directly to Spirit's side and placing a small hand on the filly's neck. "And who might you be?" Dr. Cheney asked with a smile. "I'm Lily," she replied confidently, "and this is Spirit. The others are Valor and Scout, and their mama is Liberty." Ranger Reeves chuckled. "You've named them already, I see." "They needed names," Lily said with the unassailable logic of childhood. "Everyone needs a name." Dr. Cheney completed her examination, then rejoined Ranger Reeves and the family. They're in remarkable condition considering what they've been through. The mare's wound is healing well, and the foals are responding to the care you've provided. "What happens now?" Marco asked, the question that had been weighing on him since the BLM vehicle had arrived. Ranger Reeves and Dr. Cheney exchanged glances. Standard procedure would be to transport them to our holding facility, Reeves explained. They'd be evaluated for the adoption program. Lily's face fell, her hand tightening protectively on Spirit's neck. But they want to stay here, she protested. They chose us. Dr. Cheney knelt to Lily's level. I understand you've grown attached to them, she said gently, and they do seem comfortable here. But wild horses are federally protected. We have protocols we need to follow. They'd be separated, wouldn't they? Elena asked. For the adoption program. Dr. Cheney nodded reluctantly. Most likely, adult mares and foals are sometimes adopted together, but it's rare for someone to take all four. Marco felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. The thought of Liberty being separated from her foals, or worse, all of them being distributed to different homes after what they'd clearly endured to stay together, struck him as fundamentally wrong. There must be alternatives, he said, struggling to keep his voice even. They sought shelter here. The mare brought her foals specifically to this property. Ranger Reeves looked thoughtful. There is the foster program, he mentioned. In special circumstances, we allow approved individuals to serve as long-term foster homes for Mustangs that aren't immediate candidates for adoption or return to the wild. Like the mare's injury, Elena suggested. That's one consideration, Dr. Cheney confirmed. Also, the young age of the foals and their apparent habituation to human contact. It wouldn't be safe to return them to the wild right now, especially with drought conditions. Hope flickered in Marco's chest. How does someone become approved? For fostering, there's an application process, Ranger Reeves explained. Home inspection, verification of adequate facilities, demonstration of equine knowledge. It's rigorous, but not impossible, Dr. Cheney added, her expression softening as she watched Lily stroking Spirit's muzzle, the small filly leaning into the child's touch with obvious trust. If we applied, Marco asked, could they stay here while the application is processed? The BLM officials exchanged glances again. Given the circumstances, Dr. Cheney said slowly, and the fact that they're receiving appropriate care, I could recommend temporary placement pending application approval. Lily's face brightened. They can stay. For now, Ranger Reeves cautioned, we'll need to file reports and there will be follow-up visits. And you'll need to complete the foster application promptly. We understand, Marco assured him, relief washing through him. We'll submit everything required. Dr. Cheney smiled, her eyes lingering on the bond evident between Lily and Spirit. In all my years working with Mustangs, I've rarely seen wild foals this comfortable with humans after such a short time. You've established remarkable trust. Liberty established it, Elena said quietly. She brought them here, knowing somehow that we would help. After the BLM officials departed, leaving behind paperwork and instructions for the foster application, Marco stood in the barn doorway, watching Liberty and her foals. The mare had settled again, seemingly content now that the strangers had gone. She met his gaze with that same knowing look that had struck him from the beginning. You heard all that, didn't you? He murmured. You're staying, at least for now. Liberty nickered softly as if in response. Behind Marco, Lily's excited voice carried from the house where she was telling Elena exactly how they needed to fix up the barn to make it perfect for their new charges. Marco thought of Blackwood's journal, of the golden mare who had returned to the veteran's property year after year, finding safety and offering healing in return. Was it possible that some connection remained across the decades, that Liberty had somehow inherited the memory of this place as sanctuary? The scientific part of his mind rejected such fanciful thinking, but another part, perhaps the part of him that had been broken and remade by war, that understood instinctively how trauma creates bonds that transcend ordinary explanation, found the idea strangely comforting. The sound of another vehicle approaching pulled Marco from his thoughts. This time it was Sheriff Mendez's patrol car. The sheriff parked beside the house and made his way toward the barn, his expression serious. "Morning, Vasquez," he greeted Marco. "I see BLM's been here already." "Just left," Marco confirmed. "There, allowing us to apply for the foster program. Keep the horses here in the meantime." Mendez nodded approvingly. "That's good news. Thought you should know. Pike and his partner are being held without bail. FBI's involved now, treating it as part of an interstate investigation into illegal Mustang trafficking." "Any sign of other members of their operation?" Marco asked, thinking of Mendez's warning the previous day. "That's why I'm here," the sheriff said, his voice dropping. "One of Pike's known associates was spotted in town this morning, asking questions about wild horses and your ranch specifically." Marco's muscles tensed. "Description." "Big guy, mid-40s, scar along his jawline, driving a black pickup with Nevada plates. Local name is Denton, but he operates under several aliases. You think he'll make a move?" Mendez shrugged. "Hard to say. These operations are usually after larger herds for profit, not just 4 horses. But Pike might have taken this personally after being caught. And there's the matter of the gun you confiscated." Marco considered this information, his tactical mind automatically assessing threats and vulnerabilities. "We'll stay alert," he promised. "I've added some basic security measures to the barn. I'll increase patrols past your property," Mendez offered. "And I've notified the BLM rangers to keep an eye out as well. Just be careful, all of you." After Mendez left, Marco returned to the house to find Elena and Lily already at work on the foster application forms that Dr. Cheney had left behind. Lily was drawing elaborate pictures of each horse to accompany the paperwork, her small face intent with concentration. "Sheriff Mendez stopped by," Marco informed Elena quietly, mindful of Lily's presence. "We need to stay vigilant. Pike's associates might be in the area." Elena's expression tightened with concern. "Should we be worried?" Marco hesitated, not wanting to alarm his sister unnecessarily, but knowing the threat needed to be taken seriously. "Cautious," he said finally. "I'm going to set up some additional security measures." Throughout the day, Marco worked methodically to secure the property. He repaired weak spots in the fencing, installed motion sensor lights near the barn and house, and set up trail cameras at strategic points along the perimeter. The skills he'd developed protecting forward operating bases in Afghanistan found new purpose in defending his family and their unexpected guests. Elena called the school to arrange for Lily to stay home for the rest of the week, citing a family emergency. She also contacted her supervisor at the clinic, taking a few personal days to remain at the ranch. As they worked through these precautions, Liberty and her foals settled deeper into life at the ranch, growing more comfortable with each passing hour. By late afternoon, Marco had done everything possible to secure the property with the resources available. He checked the trail cameras, ensuring they were functioning properly, then returned to the barn to spend time with the horses. He found Lily already there, reading aloud from a horse care book to the attentive foals. The proper grooming of horses includes brushing the coat, cleaning the hooves, and checking for any injuries, she recited seriously, holding the book so the pictures faced the curious foals. Scout seemed particularly interested, nudging the pages with his muzzle. "I think they're enjoying the story," Marco commented, settling on a hay bale nearby. Lily nodded solemnly. "Spirit likes the pictures best. Valor keeps trying to eat the corners, though." Marco laughed, the sound startling him with its naturalness. When was the last time he had laughed without effort? Before Afghanistan, certainly. Before the IED that had taken his arm and 2 of his closest friends. "Tío," Lily said, closing her book, "are the bad men going to come back for Liberty and the babies?" Marco studied his niece, weighing honesty against protection. "Some people might try," he acknowledged. "Finally." But we're prepared now, and Sheriff Mendez is helping keep watch. Lily considered this, then nodded with surprising maturity. Liberty isn't afraid, she observed. She knows we'll protect them. Marco glanced at the mare, who stood watchfully over her foals, ears moving attentively to track every sound. I think she's always on alert, he corrected gently. That's how wild horses survive. They're always aware of danger. Like you, Lily said simply. The observation caught Marco off guard. What do you mean? You're always watching, always listening. Mama says it's because of the war, that you had to always be ready for danger, like Liberty is for her babies. Out of the mouths of children, Marco thought ruefully. Elena had obviously explained his hypervigilance to Lily in terms the child could understand, and she had made the connection to Liberty's protective behavior herself. Your mama's right, he confirmed. In the war, being alert kept me and my soldiers alive. Lily leaned against him, her small body warm against his side. Is that why you understand Liberty better than anyone else? Because you both know about danger? Marco wrapped his arm around his niece, touched by her perception. Maybe so, pequeña. Maybe that's exactly why. As evening settled over the desert, the family gathered on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the landscape in fiery hues. The paperwork for the foster application sat completed on the kitchen table, ready to be delivered to the BLM office the next day. Marco had positioned himself where he could observe both the approaching road and the barn, the Beretta now within reach beneath his chair. Beautiful night, Elena commented, sipping her tea. Hard to believe there's any danger with a sky like that. Marco nodded, though his attention remained divided between appreciation of the sunset and vigilance. Afghanistan was like that too. The most beautiful nights sometimes preceded the worst mornings. Elena studied her brother in the fading light. You've been different since Liberty arrived, she observed. More present. Marco considered this. It was true that since the horses had appeared, the cloud of disconnection that had followed him since his injury had begun to lift. Something about Liberty's trust, her determination to protect her foals, despite her own wounds, resonated with parts of him he'd thought lost. Blackwood wrote that in saving the Mustangs, he began to save himself, Marco said quietly. I'm starting to understand what he meant. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant call of coyotes and the occasional soft sounds from the barn where Liberty and her foals had settled for the night. Do you really believe there's a connection? Elena asked finally. Between Blackwood's mare and Liberty? Marco watched as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the desert sky. I don't know, he admitted. But I believe Liberty chose this place, chose us, for a reason. Whether that's some mystical connection across time or just animal, instinct doesn't matter as much as honoring the trust she's placed in us. Elena nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then we'll honor it, however long they stay. As darkness enveloped the ranch, a sense of peaceful determination settled over Marco. Whatever threats might come, whether from Pike's associates or the bureaucratic challenges of the foster program, he would face them. For Liberty and her, Foals, for Lily and Elena, and perhaps most surprisingly for himself. In the barn, Liberty stood guard over her sleeping foals, her senses attuned to the night sounds of the desert. Like the one-armed warrior who had welcomed her, she remained vigilant, protective, but also like him, she had found a place where vigilance could coexist with moments of peace, where wounds, both visible and hidden, could finally begin to heal. Under the vast canopy of desert stars, two guardians kept watch, one human, one equine, bound by understanding that transcended species, united by the silent language of those who have endured and survived. Looking back at Thomas Blackwood's journal, Marco felt an uncanny connection to the veteran who had walked this same land a century before. The parallels were undeniable. Both wounded warriors finding healing through a golden mare who had somehow found her way to this specific property. The land remembers, Sarah Runningbird had said, and perhaps it did. Perhaps Liberty carried the memory of this sanctuary in her blood, passed down through generations of wild Mustangs. The BLM had approved their foster application surprisingly quickly. Dr. Cheney's recommendation had carried significant weight, and their documentation of Liberty's initial condition had substantiated the need for specialized care. 3 months had passed since that dust-filled afternoon when the mare and her foals had appeared at their door, and the transformation was remarkable. Marco stood at the corral fence, watching Lily lead Spirit in careful circles. The once fragile Ifili now moved with strength and confidence, responding to the girl's gentle guidance as if they shared a private language. Scout and Valor grazed nearby, their coats gleaming with health in the afternoon sun. "She's a natural," Elena remarked, joining her brother at the fence. "Lily, I mean," Marco nodded. "They both are,"